You're listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is episode 16, Why Lament Surprisingly Leads to Life and Freedom. If you take your story and your wounds seriously, sooner or later, you will find yourself disoriented by tragedy and heartache. And the invitation at this point is to lament. Lament is pouring out your feelings to God before editing your words, before making them consistent with some sort of theology. It takes more faith and trust to take our sorrow to God than it does to push down what we're actually feeling. And the surprising result of lament is a renewed sense of freedom and even joy. So here is episode 16. Thanks for listening. In today's show, I want to talk about the importance of lament. And I want to look at the book of Job as a guide to lament. The book of Job demonstrates that lament lies at the core of what it means to engage well with God. If you take your story seriously, if you take your heart seriously, if you take your wounds seriously, then sooner or later you will find yourself disoriented by the tragedies and the heartaches of this world. Job is the biblical example par excellence of someone whose life is turned upside down by tragedy and heartache. So it would behoove us, therefore, to pay attention to how Job responded to the tragedies of his life. And the answer is as simple as it is surprising. He responded in two primary ways: rage and lament. We talked about rage in an earlier episode. Today we're going to talk about this whole realm of lament. Here's what we read in Job chapter 3. These are the first words Job speaks after he has lost his children, his possessions, his health. It says this: "After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, 'Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived, let that day be darkness. Why did I not die at birth? My sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me.'" Now, before we get into Job's lament itself, before we get into his actual words of groaning, it's essential to notice that perhaps the most astonishing words in Job chapter 3 are found in the very first verse, where it says, "Job opened his mouth." After this, Job opened his mouth. After what? After he loses his children, his wealth, his health, after his friends come and sit with him in silence for 7 days, after the silence, after the shock of the pain, as the horror of the pain is actually settling in, Job opens his mouth and speaks. And the first point I want to reflect on is simply that he didn't have to. He didn't have to engage with life, with his friends, with his God. He didn't have to open his mouth and speak of his pain. He could have taken his own life, or he could have killed himself in a different way. He could have numbed himself to his pain, pushed his pain down into the basement of his heart. He could have disconnected from the reality of his own life. But Job chooses not to deny his pain. He speaks about his pain. He puts words to his emotional turmoil. He finds language to express his internal reality. When your world is falling apart, will you open your mouth? Will you have the courage to express to God what you are truly feeling inside? If prayer makes you uncomfortable for whatever reason, will you journal your thoughts and feelings? I mean, what would it look like to get a notebook and give words to what is going on inside of you? Now, when Job opens his mouth and speaks, out comes a lament. Lament is expressing sorrow, sadness, grief. Lament is what comes out of you when your dreams are shattered. In verse 1, Job laments by cursing the day of his birth. And then in verse 3, he goes on to say, annul the day that I was born. And then, why did I not die at birth? He's wishing that he had never been born. His life is so full of pain that the only thing that brings him comfort is wishing that he had never been born in the first place. When pain enters your life, whether it's small or large, what do you think is the Christian response to that pain? I mean, what, in your opinion, should be your attitude when you're suffering? What are you supposed to do? It's common to think, I should ask God to increase my faith in him during this time. Or the ultimate reason I'm in so much pain is because I have made something in my life more important than God, and so I should repent. Or I should be grateful for what I do have. What I want you to see is that Job does none of that. He doesn't ask God to increase his faith. He doesn't repent of valuing his possessions or his health more than God. He doesn't think to himself, I should be grateful for what I have left. He doesn't do any of that. He wishes he was dead. He wishes he had never been born. Do you feel like it's somehow ungodly to wish you had never been born or to wish that you would die? The problem with thinking this is that there is no shortage of biblical heroes who wished that they were dead. Rebekah does it in Genesis 27. In Numbers 11, Moses says to God, put me to death right now. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah prays that he might die. In Jonah 4, Jonah says to God, take my life. It would be better for me to die than to live. And then there's Jeremiah, who uttered a lament quite similar to Job. In Jeremiah chapter 20, he says, cursed be the day I was born. Why did I ever come out of the womb? To see trouble and sorrow, and to end my days in shame. What's wrong with these people? I mean, are they self-indulgent whiners drowning in a sea of their own self-pity? According to the Bible, it doesn't appear so. It appears that wishing you were dead is, for many people, a part of life with God. It doesn't last forever, but it's real and it happens, and there's nothing unchristian about it. In fact, it's often part of the lives of people who really love God. Job's lament gives us permission to feel. And if you're a Christian, chances are you need permission to feel. Specifically, you need permission to feel the so-called negative emotions, like anger, fear, sadness. We think there's something wrong with sadness, and we want to put happiness on our faces. I mean, what would happen if you walked into church with sorrow on your face rather than rejoicing? The book of Job, the book of Psalms, the book of Lamentations, these are large chunks of scripture that show us that it's okay for our faces to display sorrow, and it's okay for our hearts to despair. There's nothing ungodly about it. In fact, it's just the opposite. Now, not only does Job give us permission to feel, but he gives us permission to talk, and here's the key word, candidly about our feelings. To talk candidly about our feelings. In other words, Job invites us to pray our feelings. To pray your feelings is to pre-reflectively pour out your feelings to God. Pre-reflectively, before you've reflected on your feelings and judged them as good or bad, as godly or ungodly. To pray your feelings is to pour them out to God before editing your words. When you try to give words to what you're feeling, it helps you to identify what it is that's going on in your heart. So when was the last time you just poured out your feelings to God? Before editing your words, before making them appropriate for expression to a holy God, before making them consistent with some sort of theology. And more specifically, when was the last time you poured out your sadness to God? In Job 3, we meet a man in a state of disorientation. Job is disoriented, and he is writing, he's praying candidly out of his place of disorientation. His world has gone on tilt, and he's expressing himself from that place. He's not denying that he's disoriented, that he can't figure out what is going on and which way is up. He's expressing himself in the midst of that disorientation. We think it's almost necessary just to survive. We think we are living in a well-ordered and just world, a basically fair world. And this carries you along for some time. But then something tragic happens. A life-threatening illness, or the loss of a job, or marriage problems, or whatever it is for you. Something bad happens, and what you thought was a safe, fair world comes crashing down. You're disoriented. God's invitation to you in that moment is to lament. When the world as you understood it falls apart, God's invitation to you is to lament. Now, lament consists of two things. Number one, allowing yourself to feel your sorrow. And then number two, expressing that sorrow, giving words to it, or if not words, nonverbal expression, but expressing that sorrow. We're reluctant to use the language of lament very often because it seems to be an expression of distrust in God rather than trust. We read Job say in chapter 3, verse 11, "Why did I not die at birth?" And we think a Christian shouldn't be saying things like this. I mean, who are we to question God? Let me put it this way. If someone came up to you and was in a state of great pain and full of lament and said to you, "I wish God had just let me die at birth," what would your response be? What would you think about their words to you? The tendency is to think, hold on. God has created you for a reason. You need to trust him with whatever he is doing with your life. And wishing you were dead is basically saying you don't trust God with your life. So isn't saying, "God, I wish that I was dead," evidence of one's distrust in God? What I'd like to suggest is that these words depict the anguish of the soul, yet they are characteristic of a life of deep faith. It takes more faith and trust to take our sorrow to God than it does to push down what we are actually feeling. It takes trust, it takes faith, it takes risk. Now, whenever I talk about lament, I am invariably asked, what's the point of it? I mean, what's the goal of it? Where does it take you? Isn't it self-pitying? Don't you just end up in despair? And what's the point of that? So it's a fair question. Does expressing your sorrow to God merely result in despair? Well, where did Job end up? Where did Job's lament take him? Did he end up in despair? Job's lament took him to getting angry at God, to engaging fervently with God, to calling God to account for his actions, and ultimately to actually having a conversation with God. The path of lament need not lead to despair. Despair results when we lament without hope. The resurrection of Jesus shatters all hopelessness, and it does so in two ways. First, the resurrection means that your reality can be changed. If Jesus rose from the dead, then there is no situation that cannot be reversed. The starting point of the biblical faith story is actually the reversal of hopelessness. In Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, "Go forth from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation." But just a few verses earlier, in Genesis 11, we read this: "Now Sarai, his wife, was barren. She had no child." You cannot become a great nation without a child. So listen to biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann's commentary on this passage. It is so beautiful. This is what he says: "Barrenness is the way of human history. It is an effective metaphor for hopelessness. But the marvel of biblical faith is that barrenness is the arena of God's life-giving action. After Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Hannah were all barren. Now, because the Bible is so relentlessly true to real life, Genesis chapters 12 through 14 come and go, and Sarah's still not pregnant. So the promise of God delays. And Abraham and Sarah, understandably, are moved into a season of doubt. And let me quote Brueggemann again, because it's so beautiful. This is what he says: "It is part of the destiny of our common faith that those who believe the promise and hope against barrenness nevertheless must live with the barrenness. Why and how does one continue to trust solely in the promise when the evidence against the promise is all around?" Brueggemann goes on to say, "Can the closed womb of the present be broken open to give birth to a new future? The utter impossibility of the promise becomes evident. Abraham knows what is possible, and therefore he lives in restless torment." But one of the points of Sarah's story is that there is no situation that cannot be reversed. It was utterly impossible that she could have a child, and yet she had a child. Similarly, it was utterly impossible that a man could be raised from the dead, and yet Jesus was raised from the dead. Now, the second reason that the resurrection of Jesus shatters all hopelessness is simply this: even if the situation is not reversed, you have someone who will be with you in the fire, in the heat. And hear this: more than wanting our circumstances to change, we want to feel the presence of someone in the fire with us. That is so important to me. More than wanting our circumstances to change, we want to feel the presence of God in the fire with us. We want to know at an experiential level that God himself is with us in it. In other words, it's not pain that we fear. It is aloneness and meaninglessness in the pain. The good news of Christianity is that resurrection exists, which means that reality is no longer fixed. Because of the resurrection, there is now no situation, there's no condition, there's no so-called reality that cannot be turned upside down and reversed. And it means that there is a power and a presence in the world that will be with you tangibly, experientially in the pain. That is the hope with which we enter into the sorrow of lament. Many Christians have stuffed their real feelings because we don't believe those feelings are consistent with a life of faith. You feel deep sadness and you think, I'm supposed to rejoice in the Lord always. And so you pretend like you're not full of sorrow, or you push it down and try to get it out of awareness. Most of us are deeply uncomfortable with our feelings. But here's the thing: feelings give us a window into what's going on in the deepest parts of our heart. You're powerless to control your feelings. Neuroscience has demonstrated this over and over and over. Your feelings happen in a fraction of a second, much faster than you could ever control. What God calls you to is not getting rid of your sadness or your anger or your fear. What he calls you to is honesty about whatever is inside of you. Now, to deny sorrow is it's a very odd inclination for people who take the Bible seriously, given the huge chunks of texts where people pour out their sorrow to God. We can't go through all of them, but let me just give a few examples of people pouring out their unedited sorrow to God. And I'll just use the Psalms. Psalm 6, "My soul is in anguish. How long, O Lord? How long?" Psalm 10, "Why do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Psalm 119, my eyes fail looking for your promise. I say, when will you comfort me? God has put these expressions of sorrow and despair into the scripture. Why would God have done that? He's inviting us to give ourselves permission to feel our real feelings, and then he's inviting us to pour those feelings out unedited to him. Have you poured out your sorrow to God before massaging your words, before editing them? Max McLean is an actor who has done an audio version of the Bible, and I want to play excerpts, just a short excerpt from his reading of the book of Job. This is just a portion of the places in Job where we get to listen in on Job's lament to God.
I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. My face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. My relatives have failed me. My close friends have forgotten me. The guests in my house and my maidservants count me as stranger. I have become a foreigner in their eyes. All my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I loved have turned against me. Today also my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy on account of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would pay attention to me. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. God has cast me into the mire. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. But when I hoped for good, evil came, and when I waited for light, darkness came. My inward parts are in turmoil and never still.
There it is. Expressions of deep lament, candidly spoken from the depth of his heart to his God. Now, last point, what I'd like to suggest is that Job's willingness to lament actually reveals his glory. What does that mean, his glory? What is someone's glory? Each one of you has been created in the image of God. And God is, in his essence, glory. The Hebrew word for glory, kavod, means weightiness, solidity, substance, splendor. Your glory is the unique way that you reflect God's splendor. It is the part of you that is truly beautiful, full of substance, full of splendor. Each one of us has a measure of glory. The question is, what is your glory? What makes you you? What is the unique way that you reflect the glory of God? Now, let's look at Job's glory. Here's the astonishing thing about the book of Job. The book of Job begins with God showing off one of his creatures. The book begins by God saying to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? He is blameless and upright." God is showing off Job to the cosmos. He's saying, look at this man Job. He is godly and he is upright. Now, what does it mean to be in the words of the text, blameless and upright? It means to love God himself more than you love anything else. Satan, in the beginning of the book of Job, accuses God of only being desirable for his blessings. The book of Job shows a man who, and here's why Job is really properly understood more as a comedy than a theodicy, because the book of Job shows a man who, once deprived of all his blessings, wants one thing and one thing only, and that is interaction with God. He wants God to speak to him. He wants God to respond to him. If you read the rest of the book of Job, what you'll find is that Job's not primarily angry about the injustice of what has happened to him. He is not primarily angry about the loss of his health, his wealth, his children. He is primarily angry about God's silence in the face of that injustice. Job doesn't want injustice to be made right as much as he wants God to explain himself. Job wants God to speak to him, to respond to him, to engage with him. In other words, do you see it? Job's desire is for relationship with God. The more the book unfolds, the more Job desires interaction with God, response from God. Now, think about this in light of Satan's accusation, which is, God, Job only loves you for your blessings. He's only interested in you because you bless him. You got to keep in mind, Satan's accusation is not against Job. It's against God. He's not saying, Job, you only love God for his blessings. He's saying, God, you are not desirable in your person. You are only desirable for what you give people. And so the experiment begins. How will Job respond to the removal of all God's blessings? Will he still want God? Now, the further you read in the book of Job, the more you will find yourself laughing. There's the comedy, laughing at Satan's accusation. In chapter after chapter, you see Job's desire for God growing rather than waning. Job wants one thing, interaction with God. He wants God to show up and speak. The whole book of Job is one gigantic mockery of Satan's accusation that God is only desirable because he gives good gifts. God was right to show Job off to the cosmos. Why? Because Job really wanted God himself more than anything else in the world. That's the point of the book of Job. That is Job's glory. His glory is that he loves God just for God, not for what God gives him. He wants God himself. One of the things I've noticed as I've talked with Christians over the years is simply this. I hear their story. I hear how much pain they have experienced. I hear them express their confusion about why God allowed so many bad things to happen to them. And then I hear about how they cannot let God go. They keep going back to church, or they keep going back to engagement with this God who has allowed hurt to come into their lives. And it dawns on me, you're a real Christian. You want God more than God's blessings. And I just sit there stunned by their glory. You actually love God for his person. Despite your confusion, despite your pain, your desire for God has actually grown in the midst of your trauma and your heartache. And it's just a moment of being stunned by their glory, by their love for God himself. So that last bit was clearly a digression from the subject of lament, but I had to get it in because it does show that lament is one of the most faithful responses you can make to the reality of this world and to the reality of God. Thanks for listening. If you are wanting to engage your story at a deeper level, I have 3 resources on my website that are designed to help with that. One is about how to write a story. Another is about the 6 things that every child needs from their parents. And the third is about attachment. You can access those documents by going to adamyoungcounseling.com. Click on any podcast episode and then just scroll down a bit and they will be there in red. Take care. See you next week.